pollen. That's crazy.
Well, it is the Midwest, and it is that time of year. Welcome to the 7 o'clock talk, and I am Dr. Miller, and this is Nurse Jessica, and we are here to represent Integrated Health of Indiana. And tonight we're going to talk about acid reflux and GERD and all of those wonderful things that people take proton pump inhibitors and all of that jazz for. You want to take a moment and tell them, oh,
Heck, the sun is too bright.
I just got home, so we really didn't get prepared for this, but we wanted, at least I wanted, to be out in the gazebo because it's nice out. We haven't had a chance to be out here yet. So, yep, that helps tremendously. So, Jessica, hon, why don't you explain to them um, medically what we look at, or you guys look at for GERD and esophageal reflux?
What do we look for?
What do you look for? What are the common causes that you guys look at? All that stuff.
Well, I mean, we don't really look for it, but they usually medicate it when you are complaining of burning, upper stomach pain, can't sleep, but it's usually caused from a lot of times you have a hiatal hernia or your hiatal sphincter doesn't close properly. So when you lay down to sleep, it comes up. So we usually try putting a wedge under you. Um, food, food's usually related. I think a lot of times people medicate acid reflux because they think they have too much acid. In reality, they probably have too little and they're not digesting their food well.
So there's a lot of things that basically medically they look for, and they have what? How many different treatments for it do you think?
Well, there's non-medical and there's non-surgical. So first thing they try to do is, if you have a really great MD, they change your diet, and then they ask you to put a wedge under your pillow and or to sleep, sitting kind of upright so that that doesn't come up. Um, Once you done that and they don't get any relief, they usually try like an acid reflux or a proton pump inhibitor, and then if that fails, there's multiple ones you can use, but once they all fail, then they usually try to do um, what we call a nissen, which they go in and they take your top of your stomach and they pull it up and they wrap it around the lower esophagus and they tighten it. And believe it or not, sometimes that fails, but that actually causes a lot of scarring. So now they do the new thing. They call it the Lynx procedure. They actually go in and they put in a bunch of magnets around the top of the stomach. And so as you swallow, it opens the magnets, and as soon as the bolus of food or water goes through it, it closes. But that's not reversible. So
And we've had at least one patient with some of those because he couldn't swallow the Heidelberg pill, could he?
yeah, he had a. I don't. He did not have the links. He actually wanted the links, but they can't. He had
The Nissen, I
Nissen,
thought. Yeah.
and he they couldn't revise it because it was too scarred.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that doesn't necessarily happen to everybody. It just happened to him,
Him,
and
yeah.
it can happen to people. It just depends on how you heal.
And so when we look at gastroesophageal reflux, there are a lot of things. I mean, when I was asked this question and asked to present on it again, I looked at her and I laughed and I said, "How do you explain this? This field is so wide open that it's it's kind of crazy." So I thought we'd start very simply by saying gastroesophageal reflux typically can be, in this area, we see it mostly dealing with either bacteria that are not supposed to be in the body, adrenal stress, parasites, or just a crappy diet, which the crappy diet is the most common.
So getting back to that, a lot of people actually have H. pylori,
Yep.
which causes it's a bacteria that lives in the stomach. When it's out of check, can actually cause peptic ulcer disease, which is basically an erosion in your stomach lining, which bleeds. So that the ulcers, um, and they also go on a proton pump inhibitor. And a lot of times those bleed, and they have to go in and do repair work. But
So let's talk about first things first. If you eat too much food, it is normal to get some repeating and stuff like that. If as we were talking while I was driving, if you are on a proton pump inhibitor or an acid inhibitor, what happens to the food that you eat?
so you want me to tell them how that works and why that's not good? So you have in your stomach lining, you have proton pumps, and those proton pumps essentially put out hydrochloric acid, and that basically helps digest your food. But you also, that goes through your duodenum, and your duodenum actually puts a bunch of neutralizer in there so that stomach acid doesn't actually burn through your intestines. But if you take Protonics or Pepsid or things like that, Pepto Bismol, they all do the same thing. Um, you're actually buffering that, so you're neutralizing the acid in your stomach. So that actually causes all kinds of problems in some cases, because when you can't digest your food, a lot of times meat, and two, um, you don't kill the bacteria that you swallow that gets into your stomach that shouldn't go through your system.
Well, and what happens to us is when you're taking those proton pump inhibitors, hydrochloric acid is your first line of defense. It keeps bacteria from growing. And the kicker here is when we're young, that those proton pump inhibitors and all that seems to work pretty well, and you can rebound. But the older you get, if you know anybody that has GERD or acid reflux or any of those things, what happens to them? They have to take more, and they have to take more, and they have to take more, and then eventually they're on 2 or 3. We had a patient that was on, golly, she was taking Rolaids every day.
There was, I think, 3 specifically.
Yeah, she was on
2 prescriptions, and then she ate Rolaids incessantly and Tums.
like Tic Tacs.
So if I will say, if you're going to do that, at least take Tums, because Tums actually has calcium in it, and it doesn't have anything that causes your stomach lining to bleed. But you should actually fix the problem. But also be aware, a lot of times old school is people will take Pepto Bismol, because the stomach loves the bismuth part of it. But just be aware that that actually has aspirin in it, so you can actually compound the problem that you're trying to prevent.
So, and typically, if I remember right, calcium carbonate is in Rolaids, and when you're taking the
aluminum, there is some calcium, but Rolaids works with aluminum.
Well, you definitely don't want aluminum, because that attacks the brain, and you start working on, just go Google Alzheimer's and aluminum, or Parkinson's, or neurodegenerative diseases.
I'm going to Google that just to make sure I'm right, but it used to have some aluminum.
So regardless, when we're looking at this stuff, you really want to get to the bottom of it. So there are several things that can start to trigger acid reflux. And from a psychological standpoint, if you are in stress, if you're in fight or flight, that will start to degrade the secretory IgA in the stomach, allowing things to get through. So now you're starting to get systemic things. So we do a test called a GI map. Yes, ma'am?
I was going to tell you what it has. The active ingredients now is calcium carbonate and magnesium hydroxide.
So calcium carbonate, any carbonate form is a really crappy form. and it will keep you from doing your other minerals. So we do a GI map, and when we look at the GI map, there are several things to look at. And one of the things to look at is how the adrenals are going. And if you see, this is my key, so I'm always marking it up. But if you see secretory IgA taking a hit, then what happens is we know that there is a couple of different forms of stress, and we need to make sure that psychologically, if you have psychological stress, we got to address that. You have to have a plan in place to take care of that psychological stress, because if you never get out of that fight or flight, then rest and digest never happens. And so when you have psychological stress, that decreases your ability to produce secretory IgA, which lowers the defenses in the stomach and allows for further infection of bacteria and parasites and viri and stuff like that. And then you also slow down the system because that starts to attack the thyroid. So if you've been following us for any point in time, you've heard me talk about this link and this connection. So then if you're under stress and your thyroid's being attacked and your stomach's being attacked, you can start to get joint pain, you can start to have back pain, everything just starts to compound. The old saying, when it rains, it pours. Well, that's very true, especially as we look at that. Yes?
Gaviscon now is the one that contains aluminum currently. So
just read your ingredients. If you read aluminum in there, don't take it.
Yeah, you really have to read all the ingredients too.
And, don't put aluminum underneath your arms, because guess what? That's real thin skin and it soaks in and will cause other issues. But back to the GERD. So now, even if you went under a little bit of stress and you caused a problem and you've taken PPIs, if you take PPIs, that allows for H. pylori to come in and populate. And so we start a big snowball effect here where we can allow people that have problems with yeast. When you hear, oh, I got candida, or somebody has a problem with candida, if you're female and you take antibiotics and you get a yeast infection, that's an overgrowth of candida. All of these things can start to happen, and that causes that acid reflux to get worse. And if you're on a PPI, the body naturally says, hey, I have to have this acid to break stuff down. So if I don't have really strong concentrated acid, I'm going to increase the volume of acid. And what we see when we run the Heidelberg on people is that the hydrochloric acid is actually not too strong. The hydrochloric acid is actually weak. And we use hydrochloric acid, and especially if somebody has a H. pylori infection. H. pylori, we used to think it was an acidophile, that it loved hydrochloric acid, or yeah, that it loved the acidic environment. We know that that's not true. We know that it loves actually uric acid. And so if you have high uric acid, then chances are you're going to get an H. pylori infection, because that stuff, the enzyme in the H. pylori is sensitive to uric acid to the tune of one drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So think about that. You take one eyedropper and you just put a drop of whatever into the pool. If that's uric acid, H. pylori can find it and will swarm it. So we look at that, how that happens. And so you have to have the digestive enzymes working. And if you don't have those digestive enzymes, and you don't have the hydrochloric acid, and you don't have all that stuff working, you really open yourself up to biofilms. So if you are taking a course of antibiotics or something, and you get done with the antibiotics and it comes right back, well, then probably you're dealing with a biofilm. You've done something long term, and now you got to break this down. So you can see how the acid reflux, especially if you cause it yourself with food, So if you eat a simple carbohydrate diet, lots of breads, lots of pastas, things that you can overeat, and you're drinking lots of sodas or alcohol does it pretty well to people too. If that is what your diet consists of, then you're going to have a very long, painful road to hoe. And just because you can drink alcohol doesn't mean you should. And just because you can drink soda doesn't mean you should. And so the next thing that can cause GERD, so we know stress can cause GERD. We know that a diet can cause GERD. But we also know that overgrowth of bacteria. So when we start to look at things like this, bacterial pathogens, when we start to see those happening, then we know that the H. pylori can be because of that overgrowth. And when you see things like that, that shows us this is another set of opportunistic microbes. And those opportunistic microbes, when they get into dysbiosis, they start to throw off the pH. They start to throw off the environment in the stomach, allowing things like H. pylori, allowing things like the hydrochloric acid to go out of balance. And when that happens, you have problems. If you're constipated, things back up and they don't clear out and it causes problems. If you have diarrhea, you're not in balance. So it's, as you can see, anything can cause anything. So can I sit here and say, hey, you need to take mastic gum for H. pylori because that's what causes um, GERD? No, I can't. Just to sit here and do a blanket statement is doing a disservice. But there are things that you can try. So if you have questions about GERD, if you want to do some things holistically, feel free to reach out to us and we can start to help you with some enzymes. But just be prepared that if that stuff doesn't work, then there's work to be done. And especially if you're like me, 52, a little overweight, not really working out, and I start to get acid reflux, then for me as a doctor looking at me, I get really scared because you're not doing a lot of the things that you should do, and it allows for a lot of opportunistic bacteria and things like that to take advantage of you, especially if you have a crappy diet. So it's one of those things that don't take it lightly because it will cause larger problems down the line, and we see it time and time and time again. Anything I missed there?
So,
So those are several of the things to start to look at and think about with GERD. And you can see wide wide spanning it is. If I get acid reflux, it's not because of my diet, most likely. I've probably got an infection. If it's the typical American that is eating fast food and processed food, I'm going to go to diet first because that's probably what's causing it.
alcohol causes it most often.
Yep, and alcohol. So those are the things that I start to look at. And then next is if it's not the diet, if the diet's on point, if stress is pretty good, then we really got to get in there and do some testing and see how your body is doing. So thank you for your time tonight, and I hope you learned something. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us at Dr. Miller at Integrated Health of Indiana.com. Oops, that too is supposed to be an at. So as that posts, you can send any questions there, and we would love to help you out. Thank you.